All right. Pull up our PowerPoint. All right, so correct me if I am wrong, but on Monday, the last thing we talked about was Lucy. We talked about the Lucy fossil, and we watched a short video clip on Lucy, on the discovery of the Lucy fossil with Dr. Donald Johanson. Does that sound about correct?
That is correct.
Perfect. Okay. All right, so just to review, the Lucy fossil, her genus and species name. So when you see those big long names like that, the first half is the genus name. So her genus name is Australopithecus, and then her species name is AFARENSI. So that big long name, Australopithecus afarensis, means southern ape from the Afar. So her biological sex is female. The date range for the species is about 3 to 3.6 million years old. She was discovered in Eastern Africa in a site called Hadar in Ethiopia, discovered by Dr. Donald Johanson in 1974 and colleagues. So some of her features, so the postcranial from the neck down, that word postcranial just means from the neck down. She was likely a habitual or essentially a part-time biped, because just like Artie, her postcranial anatomy was very mosaic, meaning that she had some features that indicated bipedal locomotion and some features that indicated retention of brachiation and quadrupedal locomotion. So her pelvis is more like a biped, but she also had long arms and curved finger bones, which is more like a brachiator. So that suggests some degree of arboreal activity. She has a small non-honing canine, which is a very hominin-like characteristic. That's one of the features of a hominin, is a reduced canine and non-honing canines. She has large molars. So all of the Australopithecines, especially once we get to the robust forms, all Australopithecines will have larger molars in comparison to the incisors. And the reason for that is quite simply their diet. They were consuming a diet of rough, tough food items like vegetation. I mean, sometimes you don't necessarily think of vegetation as rough and tough, but think about chewing spinach or chewing carrots or celery. It takes a lot of chewing pressure, especially if you're not cooking it, beforehand. If you're cooking a cooked carrot's a lot easier to consume than a raw carrot. But the species and the other Australopithecines were most likely not controlling fire, and they probably weren't using a whole lot of tools to process their food prior to consumption. So some of the other features when you're looking at the crania, so this is a replica of not the Lucy fossil, but an Australopithecus afarensis fossil that is a male version, so a little bit more robust. So when you turn the skull over and look at it from the superior view, so how far it pinches in behind the brow, we're going to call that post-orbital constriction. So start to learn this terminology. These features are going to come back to you consistently. So how far it pinches in behind the brow, we call that post-orbital constriction. So typically we see a high degree of constriction in species with a relatively smaller brain size, especially of the frontal region. So post-orbital constriction, how far it pinches in behind the brow, is indicating that the frontal region is relatively small, especially in comparison to genus Homo and especially in comparison to Homo sapiens. So along with that, the zygomatic flare, so zygomatic bones are the cheekbones, but the zygomatic flare refers to how far the cheekbones flare outwards to the side. So we tend to see higher degrees of zygomatic flare in species that have a rougher, tougher food items in their diet, and a lot of jaw pressure needed. So the reason for that, I mean, you may not think that those two things are connected, but the jaw muscles are going to start all the way at the ramus, and then they're going to tuck underneath the zygomatic bones. And then once we get to the robust forms, we'll see that they attach all the way up here at the sagittal crest. That's the bony mohawk feature that runs down the center, like we saw in the male gorilla. So the gracial forms, you're going to notice, do not have a sagittal crest. They have a nice smooth crania. But even though they don't have a crest, they still have more powerful jaw muscles than we do, for example. So that's why they need these flaring zygomatic bones, so that there's enough room for those powerful jaw muscles to tuck underneath them. Okay, so we call that zygomatic flare. So that's simply how far do the cheekbones flare outwards to the side. Other features to keep an eye out for, so turning the skull so you can see it from the side. So looking at a lateral view. So degree of prognathism refers to how far does the midface and jaw jut forward. So we tend to see higher degrees of prognathism in the Australopithecines. And once we get into genus Homo, we'll see that the prognathism will gradually decrease. And by the time we get to Homo sapiens, we have pretty vertical faces in comparison. The supraorbital ridge, that's the ridge of bone that's directly above the eyes. Remember, orbits are eyes. The word supra means above. So the supraorbital ridge is the ridge of bone directly above the orbits. Okay, so we tend to see pronounced double-arched brow ridges in species with more powerful face muscles. Okay, by the time we get to Homo sapiens, in comparison, our brow ridges are pretty gracile, pretty delicate. Other feature, turning the skull around so you can see it from the back, the position of maximum skull breadth. So we want to look at the widest point. So in Lucy, we see that the widest point is all the way down here at the base. By the time we get to Homo sapiens, the widest point will move all the way up to the top on the parietals. So that's related to expansion and cranial capacity. But all of the Australopithecines, pretty much every species we're going to look at from 4 million years ago all the way to as recently as about 2 million years ago is going to have a relatively small cranial capacity. We'll see it, jump up a little bit with some of the robust forms, and we'll see it jump a little bit when we get to Homo habilis, but we're not going to see any significant jump in cranial capacity and brain size until we get to Homo erectus, who we'll talk about next week. All right, questions about Lucy? Okay, so let's move on to another Australopithecine. So, pay close attention to her name. So her name is Australopithecus africanus. So you notice that the genus name is the same. So the first half, Australopithecus, is the same as Lucy. So within the same genus, but now we're looking at Africanus. So same genus, different species. The nickname for this fossil is Mrs. Place. But interestingly enough, now that we have discovered more fossils that we attribute to this species, it is now believed that this particular fossil is actually a male. So originally thought to be female, now believed to be male. The date for this fossil is about 2.5 million years old, found in South Africa in a site called Sterkenfontein, discovered by Broom and Robinson in 1947. So one of the earliest fossil hominins uncovered, even before the Lucy fossil. So some of the features we're looking out for, so slightly more rounded crania, more rounded skull, slightly less prognathism, so less projecting face, absence of cranial crest, so no sagittal crest, no nuchal crest. Nuchal crest is something that we'll see in the back. Relatively small non-honing canines, and still relatively small cranial capacity. Cranial capacity is about 485 cc's. So right within the range of Lucy's, just a little bit bigger than what we see in chimps and bonobos. Still not significantly larger. All right, so this is Australopithecus africanus. I encourage you guys to practice saying these names. Questions about africanus? All right, let's talk about the next one. This one is Australopithecus sediba. So I'm going through all the gracile forms with you guys first, and then I'll go through the robust, just to kind of explain the order of my slides here. So remembering back to what we talked about on Monday, there's two main groups of the Australopithecines. There's the gracile forms, and then there's the robust forms. So I'm telling you guys about the gracile forms first, and then we'll talk about the robust. SEDIB is a pretty interesting find because it was uncovered for many reasons. It was uncovered in a limestone cave, so it was pretty easy to radiometric date the fossil. So that's why you see a very specific date on this fossil. The date is about 1.97 million years old. So we're moving into the Middle Pleistocene era. So this is a later Australopithecine. So by later, I mean closer to that transition from the Australopithecines to genus Homo. In fact, SEDIB coexisted with early members of genus Homo, because we see genus Homo emerge about 2.5 million years ago. So SEDIB coexisted not only with the Australopithecines, but also early members of our genus. The site is in South Africa. It's called Malapa Cave. and the limestone cave allowed for really accurate radiometric dating. The habitat that SEDIB lived in would have been a mixture of forest and grassland. This particular species has been proposed to be potentially a possibly direct common ancestor or direct ancestor of genus Homo. And this is certainly debated since members of genus Homo predate this species. Homo habilis goes back 2.5 million years old. So rightfully so, many paleoanthropologists contradict or say that it's not possible that SEDIB is the last ancestor between Australopithecines and genus Homo. But it's also possible that Homo habilis was an evolutionary dead end and that SEDIB actually led to the genus, to whatever species led to our eventual species. So it's up for debate, but just so it is one of those species that has been proposed to be the common ancestor for genus Homo. Anatomical features, you're going to see a lot of commonalities from what we've seen with the other Australopithecines. So still relatively small brain, about 420 cc's, relatively small incisors. From the neck down, the postcranial anatomy is mosaic, just like we saw in Lucy, just like we saw in Ardipithecus. So we're seeing a mixture of characteristics that indicate bipedal locomotion mixed in with features that indicate retention of arboreal climbing and brachiation. So relatively small body and long arms, indicating retention of arboreal climbing. Very human-like hand and pelvis, indicating at least some degree of bipedal walking. Very mosaic foot. Smaller teeth, mandibles, and zygomatic arches than the other Australopithecines, which has been proposed as one of the reasons why SEDIB deserves a place in our ancestry. Some paleoanthropologists even classify SEDIB as early genus Homo and not an Australopithecine. So a lot of the clips I'm going to show you, you'll see a lot of these paleoanthropologists debating these topics. So I'm going to show you guys a little clip. I'm going to show you a little portion of the Dawn of Humanity film. You guys will end up watching the entirety of this film next week, not this week, but I want to show you guys a little bit of a clip because it's going to touch on SEDIB. Do you guys have questions so far? Is there good? Okay. All right, let's watch our clip.
This appeared to be an entirely new species.
Make sure I've got the volume up for you guys here.
I basically brought this boy back to life.
Finally, the skull was free. Its small brain and forward-projecting face made it clear that it was an Australopith. But details of the teeth and other parts of the skeleton made it unlike any found before. Many types of Australopithecus once walked the Earth between about 2 and 4 million years ago. Lucy is known as AFARENSIS. There's also Australopithecus africanus. This appeared to be an entirely new species. Lee called it Australopithecus SEDIB, after the waterhole near which it was found. In the local language Sutu, SEDIB means wellspring. The team was able to radioactively date the limestone layers in the cave with great precision. The layer containing the SEDIB skeletons was 1.97 million years old. That makes these creatures among the last of their kind, living right at the end of the fossil gap between Australopiths and Homo erectus. Here at last was a creature that could tell us something about that transition. And the bones were not just fragments. Here were two remarkably complete skeletons, a female and a child. Still encased in the rock at Malapa are fragments of at least 3 more, waiting to be excavated. This made SEDIB the most complete evidence ever found for what was going on at the dawn of humanity.
The Australopithecus sediba fossils are some of the most spectacular skeletons known for early hominids. They're absolutely amazing. We don't get 2 bones associated with one another very often, much less several bones, much less partial skeletons. So that makes these fossils really special.
SEDIB was exciting from the get-go. Right away, we knew that we had parts of the skeleton and we had parts of the cranium, which helps us figure out who this animal is. So that was really, really exciting. And initially, these upper limb bones looked very primitive. So we knew that we were dealing with something that looked like it would be a good climber, kind of an ape-like creature.
Peter Schmidt's job is to reconstruct SEDIB's skeleton. Unlike past fossil finds, here, the skeletons are so complete, there doesn't have to be much guesswork. By scanning and mirror imaging, Peter can fill in any missing bones with great accuracy.
From the CT, we got a few thousand slices now. And Aurora has to put everything together to form a 3D model. And then we have to cut the model because the pelvis we already casted. So we only need the rib cage. But the right rib cage we have already, but we need now the mirror image of that. And the computer helps us to do the mirror image in a second.
Layer by layer, a 3D printer then slowly prints the rib cage in fine plaster.
Ah, beautiful.
Finally, Peter has assembled a complete skeleton. It's highly unusual. All Australopiths are a mix of ape and human, but SEDIB has a unique mosaic of features scientists have never seen before in the same creature.
The arm is very long, like in a chimpanzee, but the hand is with short fingers and a very long thumb, like a human hand, which was never found until now, because this is the most complete hand ever found in this period.
Job Keeby, who was with Lee and Matthew when they discovered the skeletons, has been working on the SEDIB hand. He's found an unusual combination of ape and human features here, too.
What's special about SEDIB's arm and hand is that we know SEDIB has a very long arm, which is more chimp-like. But SEDIB has a very human-like hand. For example, SEDIB has a thumb which is longer relative to the other fingers, which indicates a human-like condition.
SEDIB's hand, with its opposable thumb and forefingers, is so human that it could have been a tool user. But since no tools were found, that remains only an intriguing possibility. From the reconstructed skeleton, paleo artist Victor Dieck can start to create a lifelike digital painting. By virtually applying tissue thickness markers carefully calculated from the known facial tissues of living primates, he can build up a realistic impression of SEDIB's face.
Once that was all done, I have now gone ahead and created a body for it. And if you want to see, we can check all that by going transparent. and making sure that the bones and everything line up in the proper spaces. So here we have a concept reconstruction of how SEDIB potentially could look like.
The step from there to a lifelike digital painting is a short one. Finally, for the first time in almost 2 million years, the face of Australopithecus sediba looks out on the world once again. But the true revelations will come from the bones themselves. Because they are so well preserved, these fossils will give scientists unprecedented insights into the lives of these ancient creatures. Everything from what they ate to how they died. Such details might help explain the Australopith's transition into our genus, Homo. They might also prove or disprove a highly influential theory about the dawn of humanity. A theory inspired by the very first discovery of an Australopith fossil.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and pause there, but I really like this documentary because it does a really nice job of not only showing you the fossils that were uncovered, but also showing you what scientists do behind the scenes and showing you how paleo artists like Victor Dieck use knowledge of tissue depth and knowledge of how muscles attach to the bone to help reconstruct what these hominids might have looked like. Because of course, bone can be great, but we all want to know what they look like, right? We want to know what they look like, how they behaved, how they interacted. That's really exciting stuff. So I really look forward to you guys watching this whole documentary because I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. It's one of the better ones out there. All right, do you guys have questions on SEDIB so far? Okay, so you notice a lot of the same things we were talking about with the earlier forms. They talked about in the video we just watched, a video clip, mixture of ape-like and human-like features. So that's what we mean when we say mosaic. So this is really a creature in transition. So if you've ever heard anybody say that there are no examples of transitional fossils, you can tell them that they're wrong, because actually there are many examples of transitional fossils. We see many examples of that transition between the Australopithecines and genus Homo, or between, quadrupedal and arboreal into gradually bipedal. So we see many of these transitional fossils as we're going to go through the fossil record, continued on today and into next week. All right, so that's SEDIB. All right, Australopithecus gari. So this one, along with SEDIB, is another one that has been proposed to be a possibility for the last common ancestor, the last ancestor before we get to genus Homo. And this one makes a little bit more sense, at least with the date range. This one is called Australopithecus gari. This one was discovered by Dr. Tim White in Eastern Africa. The habitat of gari would have been mainly woodland. Anatomical features, we're getting more into the robust forms. We're seeing that the premolars and molars are far larger than the incisors and canines. So essentially the teeth in the back of the mouth are much bigger than the teeth in the front. So indicating a diet of really rough, tough food items requiring powerful jaw muscles. Really prognathic jaw. So remember that, this is not gari, but just to remind you what prognathism is when you turn the skull to the side. Prognathism refers to how far does the midface and the jaw project forward. From the neck down, we see a more human-like humerus to femur ratio. So remember the humerus, that's the long bone in our upper arms. The femur is the long bone in our thigh. So for bipeds, we have longer legs than arms. So that's a transition, because with the brachiators or knuckle walkers, they have longer arms and legs. So when we see this transition to a more human-like humerus to femur ratio with femurs that are longer than the humerus, we can see that as evidence that we're starting to transition to more of a commitment to bipedal locomotion. Doesn't mean the Gari wasn't still likely using arboreal locomotion as well. Likely that species was, all the Australopithecines likely were. It just means that maybe that transition is becoming more solidified. So that's one of the reasons why Gari is considered to be a probable ancestor of genus Homo. Cranial capacity is still relatively small, about 450 cc's, so right within the range of what we saw with Afarensis, with Africanus, with SEDIB, right within that range. Another interesting thing about Gari is possibly the first user and maker of stone tool technology, because we have, paleoanthropologists have uncovered some basic stone tool markings. So essentially the way that the Oldowan tools make their mark on bones as you would use them to scrape flesh from the bones. We see some antelope bones with these cut marks found in association with Australopithecus Gari. And the more evidence we uncover on the fossil record, we see that fossil use, or the fossil evidence for tool use, may date back as old as 3 million years ago. It was once thought that, fossil tools date back about 2.5 million years ago, and there is really solid evidence. I mean, by the time we get to about 2.5 million years ago, we see pretty solid evidence for the use of Oldowan tools. But there is some, there's been some recent papers that have been published that are suggesting that it goes back even deeper. All right, so that's Gari. So that's our last one. Gari is kind of a little bit robust, a little bit gracile, but now we're going to transition into the robust forms. So when you see this Paranthropus word, this big long Paranthropus word, just know that Paranthropus is the genus name that is associated with the robust Australopithecines. So you're going to see some variations. So looking at this picture here, when you see that fossil replica, that doesn't necessarily scream human ancestor. Look, it's very, very unique looking. So we've got a very prognathic face. So the mid face juts forward really in a really extreme degree. And we see that bony. Yes, go ahead.
Is the nickname the Black Skull?
Yes, this one, the nickname is the Black Skull. Exactly.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So yeah, this one has a bony mohawk feature. We call that the sagittal crest. So obviously this is not BOISEI here or the Black Skull. This is a gorilla. But just because that's the one I have for you guys. So the gorilla, just to remind you what the crest is. The crest is that bony mohawk running down the center. And it's the attachment point for the powerful chewing muscles. So especially the robust forms were likely an evolutionary dead end simply because their diet was far too specialized. What do I always tell you guys? In the game of evolution, diversity wins. So unfortunately, this group of Australopithecines, Paranthropus, had a diet that was far too specialized. They were consuming mainly rough, tough vegetation. And essentially what that means is if all of a sudden that food source is no longer available, or there's a climatic fluctuation, they're out of luck, right? If they're only specialized to consuming one type of food and they're unable to transition or be flexible, then that they're kind of out of luck. So that's why at least most paleoanthropologists hypothesize that this is kind of an offshoot or an evolutionary dead end of human evolution, that essentially Paranthropus species did not leave any evolutionary descendants. But of course, that's all debatable. And it's certainly, possible that the species was interbreeding with some of the gracile forms. So maybe they left their mark in our genetics, but we won't necessarily know, at least, I mean, the way genetic technology is now, we can extract DNA from fossils that are about 50,000 years old and more recent. These fossils are just simply too old. Once they've completely fossilized, that means there's no organic material left. So it's very difficult to extract DNA from these fossils. I'm not going to say it's impossible because, science does amazing things all the time, but at least where the technology is right now, it is not currently possible to extract DNA from fossils that's old. So just so you guys know, some paleoanthropologists give them their own genus name, which is Paranthropus. That's where I'm at, on that debate. I say that they're different enough to deserve their own genus. But some also, some paleoanthropologists don't think that they're different enough, and they just include them within the Australopithecines. but call them robust Australopithecines. I just don't want that to confuse you in case you see it in different ways. Okay, so this is Paranthropus. This is a summary slide on that skull, the black skull. So the species name is Australopithecus or Paranthropus egyptopithecus. Date range about 2.5 million years old. So coexisted with Africanus, coexisted with Gari, coexisted with SEDIB likely, possibly even Afarensis. The site is in Eastern Africa, Lake Turkana and northern Kenya. Discovered by Walker, Leakey, Harris, and Brown, and published in Nature in 1986. Some of the features: really prognathic, projecting face, large, prominent sagittal crest and jaws, indicating a rough, tough food diet, a diet of rough, tough food items, excuse me. Small incisors and canines, massive premolars and molars. Cranial capacity right within what we would expect with the Australopithecines, right around 410 cc's for this particular species. All right, the next one, so we're still within Paranthropus. So when you look at the first part of the name, that's the genus name. So Paranthropus boisei. This is one of my favorite ones to say. This is Paranthropus boisei. A nickname for this one is Nutcracker Man. And the reason is because this particular fossil species is so robust that it was once thought that they must have been eating really tough food items like just nuts. Now we know that, this robust cranial and facial morphology results from just simply eating, vegetation mainly. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were eating nuts, although they might have been eating nuts. It just wasn't likely their predominant, dietary strategy. They were likely just eating a lot of vegetation that required a lot of chewing force. So really, really unique features, really wide concave face. I wish I had this fossil to show you guys at home. It's on my wish list. But really wide concave face. The zygomatic bones have an extreme degree of flare. Really enormous molars. So the teeth in the back of the mouth, the molars are 4 times bigger than what you'd see in modern Homo sapiens. Really massive jaw, really flaring zygomatic bones. There is a sagittal crest, but you can see it's not, it's there. You can see it. You can definitely see it, but it's not quite as prominent as what you would see in a male gorilla or in the black skull, for example. But just like all of the other robust forms, we know that the species likely had a dietary focus on tough vegetation, such as sedges and grasses, not necessarily nuts. I mean, it's very possible that they consumed nuts, but it's likely that they just focused on really rough, tough vegetation, and they did not have control of fire, so they were required to chew that vegetation for probably most of their waking hours. Remembering back to when we learned about the gorillas, they are the most vegetarian of all the primates, and they had the largest body size. So they had to spend, a large portion of their day just chomping on veggies, essentially. Cranial capacity, you'll notice this one's a little bit bigger than what we've been seeing, but still not a significant jump. We're right about 530 cc's, which is, a little bit bigger than what we saw with Artie and Lucy and some of the other Australopithecines, but still not a significant jump. Still relatively small cranial capacity in comparison to what we see with Homo sapiens. All right, this one is a new discovery. This is Australopithecus didromita. This name means close relative in the Afar language. So this one is generally attributed to the robust forms. At least I would attribute it to the robust based upon the dentition, but we only have a mandible and a little bit of a maxilla from this one. So of course, like many, more information is needed. So the date range for this species, or at least the date range on this fossil, is 3.5 to 3.3 million years old. So an older Australopithecine. So coexisted with the Lucy species, with Afarensis. Site is in Eastern Africa and Ethiopia, discovered by Johannes Haile Selassie. The features: relatively small front teeth, small anterior dentition, large posterior. So right in line with the other robust forms. So likely a dietary focus on tough fibrous vegetation. Likely a close relative of Australopithecus afarensis. That's the Lucy specimen. But we don't know for sure cranial capacity, because obviously we only have the mandible and the maxilla. We can only hypothesize. We can only look at the morphology of the mandible and the maxilla and hypothesize that the cranial capacity was likely within the range of what we see in the other Australopithecines. So anywhere from 400 to 550 cc's. But until we find more fossils that we can attribute to this species, we don't know that for certain, of course, until we have remains of the crania and not just of the mandible and the maxilla. All right, questions so far? And this is a lot of detail. Okay, so last slide before we're going to do some work in our breakout rooms, I promise. So we're going to talk just a little bit, but we're going to save most of genus Homo for next week and the week after, but just to delve into it a little bit. Let's talk about that transition. So we're transitioning from genus Australopithecine into early members of genus Homo. So 3 big changes. We're going to see a slight, and I emphasize slight, brain size increase. We're going to see some cranial shape changes. We're going to see a reduction in dentition. So most Australopithecines have a cranial capacity anywhere from 350 to 500 cc's. Early members of genus Homo, we're going to get into the 500 to 600 range. But still, it's not a significant increase. We don't see a significant jump until we get to Homo erectus. So Homo erectus, that's where we're going to get into the 800 to 1100 cc range. So, hold your thoughts on that. That's going to be what we delve into next week. We'll talk about why next week, but just know when we get into genus Homo, we see a slight brain size increase. More significantly, though, we see cranial and dental changes. So overall, the cranial shape is going to be more rounded and globular. Okay, so we're going to see a reduction in postorbital constriction. So remember, postorbital constriction, that's how far it sinks in or pinches in behind the brow. Okay, so it's a pretty, extreme degree in the Australopithecines. And then just to show you for comparison, I don't have a Homo habilis, but I do have a Homo erectus replica. So just to show you for comparison, once we get to Homo erectus, so when we're looking at the same feature, it's not the same degree of constriction. It still pinches in a little bit. There's still a little bit of constriction there, but it's a much more slight degree. Okay, so slight constriction when we get to genus Homo. And then along with that, the zygomatic flare. So remember, that's how far do the cheekbones flare outwards to the side. So in this Australopithecine, we see a pretty extreme degree of flare. But then by the time we get to genus Homo, we're going to have a reduction in the amount of flare. So that's likely due to less pressure on the jaw muscles. We no longer need these massive jaw muscles because once we get to Homo erectus, they are likely controlling fire. So they're utilizing fire to cook their food to make it easier to consume. Eating a cooked potato is much easier than eating a raw potato. That's all you have to understand in order to believe me on that one. So cooking our food made way for some serious changes. Also, not only cooking our food, but using tools to process our food prior to consumption. All right, so more rounded globular cranial shape in early genus Homo, smaller mandibles, that's the jaw muscle, that's the jaw bone, excuse me, smaller mandibles and zygomatic arches, and also decreased postorbital constriction. So along with changes in the crania, we've also got a reduction in dentition. So by reduction in dentition, I mean that essentially we're no longer going to see these really massive molars in comparison to the incisors and canines. We're going to have more generalized dentition, meaning that there's no longer a huge difference between the size of the molars and premolars in comparison to incisors and canines. So just like we talked about before, that's likely used to the control of fire and the use of tools, which allowed these ancestors to process their food prior to consuming it. So we're no longer relying on really powerful jaw muscles. We're beginning to be able to rely on culture a little bit to process our food, because that's essentially, control of our environment to enhance survival and reproduction. That's culture. So we're starting to rely upon our cultural innovations to help us survive. Okay. All right. I know that was a lot. Do you guys have any questions before I tell you what we're going to do in breakout rooms today? You're doing all right. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and stop the recording so that we'll be able to do some breakout room